On today's episode of Let's Talk Drones, we are moving forward with our NDAA compliant FPV build series, albeit with a small alteration to today's video. Originally, I wanted to integrate both the VTX and the camera onto our drone, but unfortunately, I came to a couple of realizations and had some thoughts to myself that made me realize that maybe pushing the integration of the camera one more week would actually serve us better in the long term. I'll talk about those two reasons here in just a few minutes, but have no fear, you still have plenty to learn because we are going to be integrating our VTX on board our drone. Let's get into it. Let's talk drones. What's up? It's Chris, the Drone Geek, and welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Drones. That's right, we're not going to be integrating our camera onto today's build. The reason we're not going to be integrating it, or two reasons that we won't be integrating the camera onto the build, is because A, I think it'd be better to delay it by 1 week because it gives the FPV camera that I ordered, the NDAA compliant one that I ordered, more time to get here. I did order that Aura FPV camera off of Rotor Riot's website. It is NDAA compliant, but it is still not here. The website says that they expected orders to ship in October, but here we are at November 5th, and it still has not arrived. So, and I don't have any indication that's even shipped. So just buying it a little bit more time, maybe we will be able to just skip right to the NDAA compliant camera and integrate it on board. Unfortunately, I can't use the one that Orca sent me in our last video because the body physically is just a little bit too wide. So to integrate it onto our drone would require some tools and know-how that I'm not going to assume that you have. You might be able to just move forward and use the Orca FPV camera on board the TBS Source 1 version 5, but for those of you that can't or don't have the access to the equipment to make that happen, I'm not going to put you through that. So we're just going to stick with the plan that we have, as much as we appreciate Orca sending us that camera. The other reason is actually a more practical reason. I don't have wire crimpers, and I need them in order to install the Foxier Predator version 5 on board our drone. The wire that they sent to connect the camera to the flight controller, it doesn't have JST connectors on both ends, and that normally wouldn't be a problem because I have a supply of JST connectors behind me anyway. The problem though is the one end that doesn't have the JST connector on board, the one that plugs into the flight controller, doesn't have crimped wire ends. So I have wire crimps back there that I got with one of the kits that I got for JST connector builds, but I don't have a way to actually reliably crimp those wires into those connectors. So I did order a crimper as well, and I'm waiting for that to get here. Yeah, and you don't have the option to solder directly to the F405 flight controller, at least nothing that's readily apparent in terms of options to soldering to the flight controller without tearing down some of the components of it, which we don't want to do either. So we'll just put the installation of the camera off one more week, one way or the other. Next week, you will have a camera to install on your drone. So I promise you that we will do that next week, whether it's the NDAA compliant camera or we continue to move forward with the Foxier Predator camera. But have no fear, because we are going to be integrating our TBS Unify 32G NDAA compliant VTX. You will get to see this work today and integrate onto our system successfully. But not having to fit the camera integration in actually is a little bit of a silver lining, because it allows us to use that time to explain to you a small challenge that you're going to run into when it comes to incorporating this VTX with our Orca F405 3030 flight controller. The Orca F405 flight controller has JST connections exclusively. So from what I can tell, there's no way to actually solder directly to the flight controller, which means that your options are pigeonholed to just using JST-GH connectors for that flight controller. Now, the other issue that comes in is that this also only has the JST connector by default, although there may be a way to take this apart and solder it, but we're not going to do that in this video. I do see some pads that may open that option up for you, but either way, it doesn't really solve the problem at hand very easily if you have to break this down and solder directly. If we want to use the VTX as it is right here, we are going to use that JST-GH connector. So we do have the same JST-GH connectors on the flight controller and the VTX, which makes it a little bit easier, but the problem is The VTX's JST connector is a 7-pin, and the VTX connector on your flight controller is a 6-pin. So what do we do? I turned to just about every FPV resource that I could possibly find, and I couldn't find a straightforward answer on this. It was one that I was like, I kind of think I know what I need to do, but before I move forward with this and put these components at risk of my ham-fisting, I want to check with a brighter mind than my own. So I scoured the internet. I reached out to friends. I sent messages to people that I know have more knowledge on this than I do, and I just couldn't find an answer, not a confident one anyway, until I turned to the all-powerful Reddit. And I posted a question about this exact issue where I have a 7-pin connector on my VTX and a 6-pin connector on my flight controller, and how do I make this work? And I'm just gonna go ahead and throw up some diagrams here between the flight controller and the VTX, and let's go over what we look at when it comes to comparing these two JST connectors. Let's take a look first at our VTX. So when we look at this diagram for the TBS Unify Pro 32 VTX, the NDAA compliant version, you'll see that if we put the LED light on the top and the button on the bottom, this is how our ports are ordered. On the top, we have our 7 to 26 volt in. So that's going to send between 7 and 26 volts of power into the VTX to turn it on and ensure it has what it needs to send the video signal back to the goggles. We've got a ground for that power lead. We've got a 5 volt out, and we've got a ground for that 5 volt out. We'll talk about why there's 2 power leads on this VTX in just a few minutes. We've got our video in. That's going to go from the flight controller into the VTX. It's going to take the video from the camera through the flight controller to the VTX so that it can then broadcast it back to the goggles. Then we have our TX, our Crossfire TX. That's going to send data from the VTX into the flight controller. And then we've got our Smart Audio Crossfire RX, our receiver. That's going to send data from the flight controller into the VTX. So that's what we're working with ports-wise. Now, before we talk about all of the different ports here, let's also take a look at our VTX port on our flight controller. So when we look at that diagram, we have our VTX port on the bottom. That's going to be how this is oriented. So we've got our ESC plug at the top. If you're looking at it from a top-down perspective, we'll have our VTX in the bottom right corner when we're holding it that way. From left to right, we've got a plus 5 volt out. That's a power out of the flight controller into the VTX. We've also got a ground wire. We've got our video out that will go into the video in the VTX. We've got a plus 10 volt out, so that's going to send 10 volts or more from the flight controller into the VTX. We've got our TX and our RX. So our TX, as a rule of thumb, is going to go to the RX on the VTX, and our RX on the flight controller is going to go to our TX on the VTX. So let's look at these side by side so you can sort of get an idea of how everything's going to line up once we've got them set up on the drone's frame. Now at this point, these two components should be pretty familiar to you. We've got our flight controller on the left and our VTX on the right. It's important to note the difference in orientation in these two components because we have our flight controller mounted to the frame of our drone in this photo, which means we have a top-down perspective on that JST port, whereas with the VTX, I've flipped it over so we're looking at the bottom of the component. This made it easier for you to read the labeling on the VTX as you set up your JST wiring components to make sure that everything goes where it's supposed to go. Now, it's pretty easy to follow along with this, so I'm not going to take you through step by step what each wire needs to look like. As long as the colors match from one connector to the other, you're good to go. The only thing I am going to specify here for you is what ports you need to skip when it comes to wiring your JST connectors. So on our flight controller, the port that we want to skip is actually the very first port. It's the one that's farthest to the left. We are not going to put a wire in there because that's where the 5 volt power lead goes in normally for your flight controller. So we're going to skip the first port, and every other port in that JST connector out of the flight controller gets a wire. And you can see there the colors that we have set up. You just want to wire them that way so that you've got black, yellow, red, white, and then blue, or whatever two colors you use for your final two wires, your RX and your TX. Moving over to the VTX, the two ports that you want to skip, because again, this is a 7-pin connector as opposed to the 6-pin connector on the flight controller, you want to skip the ground above the 5 volt out, and you want to skip the 5 volt out. We won't need either one of those wires, so you don't want to put anything in those ports. The reason we're not using the 5-volt out, or I guess the reason that you might want to use the 5-volt out if you want to get creative with this, is if you were powering your camera through your VTX. If you were going to wire your camera directly into the VTX, you would actually want to use these ports in order to provide power from the flight controller through the VTX and to the camera. We're not going to do that in this tutorial, but if you wanted to, you hypothetically could, and it would be possible to run your system that way. I've heard that there are pros and cons with doing it this way. One of the cons, though, that I really want to avoid, because I like to have as clean of a video feed as possible when I'm flying a drone, is you do get added noise when you provide power from the VTX into your camera. So I'd rather run the camera through the flight controller and then have the video feed go from the camera to the flight controller and then into the VTX. That's just my preference. You can do whatever you like, but we're not going to be doing it in this tutorial. Every other port, though, is filled. So the other 5 ports will be filled with a wire. And again, just reference the colored wires that I have set up here so that you can match them up and make sure that your connections are secure. So yeah, this one really tripped me up quite a bit. I thought I knew the answer, and I kind of did. I was just having a hard time understanding how to carry it out and execute it in a way that would be safe so that I didn't smoke any more parts on this drone build. I've already smoked enough. I don't want to smoke any more components to this drone. I want to just give a special shout out to user Leek Donut, Leekdonut on Reddit. They were one of a handful of people that actually responded to my cries for help on Reddit when I took that problem to Reddit and was trying to find the answers. They gave me a beautiful explanation and laid out all of the details, pretty much just how I laid them out for you, and made it very, very easy to understand how to move forward. So thank you so much, Leek Donut. Without you, I don't know if I would have been able to get this video out on time. So I really do appreciate the help that you offered for absolutely free. So that was really the meat of today's video. We are going to jump over to the workbench so that you can see everything plug in together, and I'll sort of cover some of those details again for you, but it's really easy at this point. We're pretty much done soldering, I think. We just are using JST connectors now, so the next few videos will be relatively quick when it comes to actually incorporating parts onto the drone build. Let's not waste any more time. Let's get this video done as quickly as possible. Let's head over to the workbench. Once again, since we're focusing solely on the VTX in this video, and we'll install the camera at a later date, we only have 4 components to look at for the video on the workbench. We've got our VTX. This is the TBS Unify 32G NDAA compliant version. We've got our antenna adapter, and I've also gone ahead and installed an antenna. This is only for testing. This will not be the final antenna that we use on the drone. I'll talk about why it's important to have an antenna connected to the adapter in just a few minutes. We've also got our homemade JST-GH connector for connecting these 2 components together. Again, at the beginning of this video, I talked about how to do this and what you will need to do it, so I won't be redundant and go over it again here. And we've got our Orca F405 3030 flight controller. Of course, I pulled that off of the build so that you can see exactly how this is going to look to ensure that you have no issues with your wiring between your VTX and your flight controller. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to take our 7-pin connector, which is actually on this side, and we're going to plug it into our VTX. So we're just going to snap that into place. You'll hear it click into place, and then we're going to come back over. This is the upper side of the VTX because our little clip is right there. We're actually going to flip it back over so that we can see the names of the different ports labeled on the VTX shell. So that's important that we do that. So we'll put that there just like that. We'll take our 6-pin connector. We will find the JST port for the VTX, which is right next to the MFC port. And again, we will go ahead and plug our 7-pin connector into the flight controller. What I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to plug our antenna into the back of the VTX. And this is just real easy, guys. It's just you want to make sure it's lined up so you don't break anything. But once you have it all lined up, you're just going to snap it into place. It takes a little bit of pressure and you're good to go. Everything's connected. So now that we've got our path from our flight controller to our VTX out of the antenna here set up, we can go ahead and reincorporate the flight controller onto the build and then do a test run as far as powering this up and making sure everything works correctly goes. So I've reincorporated our flight controller onto our build. We are ready to plug everything in. I do have a new smoke stopper, which I've already tested a few times and it seems to work. So everything should go well here. It's just a matter of plugging the battery in and making sure that everything turns on. So once again, going through all the components, we want our motors to beep. We want our flight controller to beep and have little LED lights blinking on it. We will want some LED lights out of this region of the VTX, and then the LED light for the receiver will be up top here just above the antenna. As long as all of those things happen and nothing sparks or smokes or does anything it's not supposed to do, we will have a working drone from a VTX standpoint. So just want to make sure everything looks good. Looking over the drone one last time to make sure that it looks good. Everything looks great. So now it's just a matter of plugging in the battery. Here we go, moment of truth. Perfect. Everything powers up, everything does what it's supposed to do, which means that we've done everything right to this point. Now, while we have the VTX sitting on there, I do want to talk a little bit about why it's important to have the antenna plugged in. The reason it's important to have the antenna plugged in is if you don't have an antenna plugged into the port that is broadcasting the video signal, because right now the VTX is trying to broadcast a video signal that it's not getting because there's no camera installed. But if you don't have an antenna installed, you run the risk of actually burning the antenna out, the connector to the antenna out, which means you no longer get video signal out of your VTX, and we don't want that, because even though this isn't the most expensive part that I've ever seen for a drone build, it is certainly not cheap. So we don't want to have to buy another VTX, especially not an NDAA compliant one. So everything looks great, guys. Let's go ahead and head back over, wrap this video up, and talk about what's next. It's that easy. It's really not too bad. I know I don't have everything attached to the drone how you'd like it to be, so it's nice and pretty and neat and clean, but again, I want to wait to get the camera on and then sort of see how everything plays in together, so I know where to mount things, where to route things, and how to do wire management. But we do have a working VTX on board this drone, at least it seems so. We won't know until we actually have a camera feed to put through to some analog goggles. But once we get to that point, we will know whether or not our VTX is working. We'll also go over some configuration things. As I've fleshed out the playlist video topics for this series, I've realized that I was maybe a little bit conservative in how many videos this series is going to be. It's not going to be tremendously more than I anticipated, but once we get all of the components in and everything's working and all the parts are getting power that they need, at that point then we get into configuring the components. So configuring the VTX for the power that we need to supply it and what kind of power it puts out to send the feed to the goggles, getting our RX, our receiver for our Ghost protocol, paired and bound to our transmitter, and just a few other settings, OSD, rates, tuning. So there will be a few videos at the end of the series where we talk a little bit about that and go through some of those more important components of your drone. Before I wrap things up, I do also want to point out, you probably already noticed this, I did replace the motors on this drone. So if you're still using the GEP RC SpeedX motors, you're totally fine. Even from an NDAA compliance standpoint, you don't need your motors to be made outside of China. You can use Chinese motors and still be NDAA compliant. But just for the sake of making this as future-proofed as possible, I went ahead and added these Conquer motors, courtesy of Mad Components. I want to thank the folks over at Mad once again for sending those over to me. So they're the exact same specs. They're 2207.5 in terms of size, and then our KV rating is 1960. So this is the exact same motor in terms of size and performance that you have with your GEP RC motors that I instructed you to buy at the beginning of this series. So if you don't want to go out and buy these and incorporate these on your build, you don't have to. You're good to go with those GEP RC SpeedX, but if you do, I've got them integrated. That's going to be the difference you see between my build and your build at this point. What did you think of today's video? Let me know down in the comments below. Is there anything else that I could be doing better when it comes to showing you how to integrate these components into your build? Let me know down in the comments below. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up icon down below. It helps me out a lot. It helps get this video out into the algorithm to more viewers like yourself. If you really love this video and you love drone content, shot by drones, about drones, and for drone pilots, my friend, this is the channel for you. Make sure you get subscribed subscribed if you haven't already, and while you're at it, hit the bell icon too. You'll get a notification every time I post a new video. Until next time, I'm Chris the Drone Geek. I'm out of here. See ya.
Yo, what you say? Steady screaming, YOLO, rockin' polo, we the fight. Everybody frontin' like they so straight.